Jason Beaumont fathered 13 children with his underage daughter. The most endogamous man ever uncovered in Louisiana. A story as real as it is disturbing, spanning generations of isolation and family practices that defy human nature itself. The year was 1976, when authorities in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, received an anonymous tip about an isolated property deep in the swamps. Approximately 40 kilometers from the small town of Opelousas lay a place locals had avoided for decades, shrouded in stories whispered only in hushed tones at local bars. The Beaumont farm had existed in that marshy region since the late 19th century, when Jeremiah Beaumont, a solitary and distrustful man, settled there with his young wife after the Civil War. What no one could have known then was that this property would become the epicenter of one of the most disturbing cases of familial endogamy ever documented in the United States. Jason Beaumont, born in 1932, was the third generation of the family to live on that land. The son of Theodore Beaumont and his first cousin Eleanor, Jason grew up with practically no contact with the outside world. The family remained isolated, growing only enough to survive and avoiding all interaction with the local community. In 1953, Jason married Martha Thibodeau, a young woman from an equally reclusive family living a few miles away. Martha bore 4 children, with Sarah, the youngest, arriving in 1959. After Martha's death during the birth of a 5th child who did not survive in 1962, Jason began raising his children alone, deepening the family's isolation. Agent Henry Reynolds, who responded to the complaint on that damp July day in 1976, described what he found in his official report. Upon arriving at the Beaumont property, I was met by a man around 45, with unkempt grey hair and a long beard. His appearance was disheveled, and he was extremely wary. I identified myself as a sheriff's deputy and stated I was there to investigate a complaint regarding the welfare of children on the property. The man, who identified himself as Jason Beaumont, hesitated but allowed me to enter the residence. What Reynolds discovered inside that wooden house, deteriorated by swamp moisture and time, would haunt him for years to come. Inside the home lived 17 people, Jason, his daughter Sarah, then 17, and 15 children, all showing clear signs of developmental issues and peculiar physical traits. The children displayed a number of obvious physical anomalies, the report continues. Many had facial deformities, motor difficulties, and appeared to have cognitive development well below their expected ages. The eldest seemed to be around 13, and the youngest was just an infant. When asked who the children were, Jason simply stated, "They're my children." When asked who their mother was, he pointed to Sarah, his own daughter. Check to see if you're already subscribed to this channel. The Beaumont history is just one of many that would stay hidden from society without our investigative work bringing these unsettling realities to light, making us question the very limits of the human condition. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single detail of this case, which will change your perspective on social isolation and its devastating effects. The Beaumont case did not begin with Jason. To understand the depth of this family tragedy, we must return to the late 19th century, when Jeremiah Beaumont laid the foundation for what would become one of the most endogamous bloodlines in recent American history. Jeremiah Beaumont arrived in Louisiana in 1868, fleeing a dark past in Virginia. Historical documents suggest he had already been expelled from his previous community due to what the euphemisms of the time called inappropriate family practices. He settled in the marshy region of St. Landry Parish with a young woman presented as his wife, but who investigators later determined was his sister, Catherine. The Beaumont family established itself in a particularly isolated part of the swamp, explains local historian Dr. Raymond Ducote, who has studied the family's genealogy. While it wasn't uncommon for families to live in relative isolation in rural Louisiana at that time, the Beaumonts took it to an extreme. They rarely came to town, and when they did, they avoided any social interaction beyond the absolute minimum. Jeremiah and Catherine had 6 children. Only 3 survived to adulthood: Thomas, Rebecca, and William. Parish records show that in 1890, Thomas married his sister Rebecca in a ceremony performed by Jeremiah himself, who cited distorted biblical passages to justify the union. From this marriage came 4 children, including Theodore, Jason's father. Theodore, in turn, married his cousin Eleanor, daughter of William. The couple had 3 children, Jason, Marie, and Robert. Marie died in childhood due to congenital heart complications, while Robert suffered from severe cognitive and physical limitations, common traits in advanced cases of endogamy. What we observe in the Beaumont family is a consistent pattern of consanguineous marriage over at least 4 generations, explains Dr. Elaine Morrow, a geneticist at the University of Louisiana. When close relatives have children, the probability of harmful recessive genes expressing themselves increases drastically. In a normal population, these genes rarely cause issues because they need to be inherited from both parents. However, in families with a high degree of consanguinity, this probability increases exponentially with each generation. Dr. Morrow continues, what makes the Beaumont case especially tragic is that we are not looking at an isolated incident of endogamy, but at a systematic practice spanning generations. Jason's coefficient of inbreeding was already extremely high due to his family history. His children with Sarah represent one of the most extreme cases of documented endogamy. When Jason took control of the property after his parents died in a 1952 fire, he already carried the weight of generations of isolation and endogamous practices. His marriage to Martha Thibodeau, while not to a known direct relative, occurred within an extremely limited social circle. Later investigations would suggest the Thibodeau family might have had distant ties to the Beaumonts, making the consanguinity coefficient even more complex. The 4 children from Jason and Martha's marriage, Michael, John, Emma, and Sarah, already showed signs of genetic issues. Michael had a spinal deformity that gave him a hunched appearance. John suffered from a form of dwarfism and had limited cognitive development. Emma had severe vision problems and was practically blind by age 10. Sarah, born in 1959, appeared to have the least obvious physical problems, though later medical reports indicated she had mild cognitive delays and an extreme docility and inability to question authority, traits that would become fatally relevant in the coming years. In 1962, after Martha died during childbirth, the Beaumont family retreated even further from the world. Jason, grieving and with 4 young children to raise, withdrew almost completely from outside contact. It was within this environment of extreme isolation, permeated by generations of endogamous practice and social disconnection, that the horror would reach its peak. The precise beginning of the inappropriate relationship between Jason and his daughter Sarah remains unclear in the official record, but testimonies gathered during the investigation suggest it started around 1973, when Sarah was about 14. Her older brothers, Michael and John, had left the property years earlier, Michael to work on Gulf oil platforms and John to join an isolated religious community that accepted his limitations. Emma, nearly blind, was entirely dependent on her father and sister. According to testimony she provided years later to social workers, Emma said, "I knew something was wrong. But my dependence, and the isolation Jason enforced, made any intervention impossible." The first child from the relationship between Jason and Sarah was born in 1974, when she was just 15. Over the next 3 years, she would give birth to 3 more children, all with severe developmental problems. By the time authorities intervened in 1976, Sarah was pregnant again. What we found on that property was the result of generations of isolation and endogamous practices taken to the extreme, explains forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine LaRue, who worked on the case. Jason Beaumont was raised in an environment where normal boundaries between family relations had been completely eroded. To him, this behavior wasn't deviant. It was simply the continuation of a family pattern. Among the investigation's most disturbing discoveries were Jason's journals, which revealed a profoundly distorted worldview based on a mix of superstition, bizarre religious interpretations, and pseudoscientific notions about purifying the family blood. In one 1973 entry, he wrote, "The Beaumont blood is special. We must keep it pure. The outside world is contaminated." Sarah understands this now. To you who are watching, this leaves us in awe. Social isolation can lead to the destruction of an entire family. This phrase captures the tragedy we are witnessing. It makes us reflect on how vital healthy social bonds are for human development. The investigation revealed Jason exercised absolute control over the property. A high fence surrounded the perimeter, and the few neighbors who approached over the years were met with hostility and threats. The nearest house was over 4 kilometers away, and the family seldom went to town. It was as if that property existed in a parallel reality, reports Harold Jenkins, one of the few tradesmen who occasionally interacted with Jason when he came to town for supplies. Everyone knew the Beaumonts were strange, but nobody wanted to get involved. Stories about them had circulated for decades, but people just preferred to keep their distance. When asked why he never reported his suspicions, Jenkins replied, "In that time and place, you didn't meddle in others' affairs, especially not when those others had the Beaumonts' reputation." As children were born from the union of Jason and Sarah, the genetic effects of extreme consanguinity became increasingly evident. Of the 13 children born by the time of the police intervention, 15 were living. This count includes Emma and a set of twins from the most recent birth. All had serious health issues. 4 had polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, 6 had significant facial deformities, 9 had some degree of cognitive impairment, 5 suffered from congenital heart problems, 3 were completely deaf, and 2 were totally blind. Sarah herself, after so many births in precarious conditions and with her own health compromised by the genetics of endogamy, was in a debilitated state. Dr. Robert Johnson, who examined Sarah after her removal from the property, reported she showed signs of multiple pregnancies in rapid succession, chronic malnutrition, and a complete lack of prenatal care. Her mental state was concerning, a combination of pre-existing cognitive limitations and an apparent psychological dissociation, likely a defense mechanism. The complaint that led authorities to the Beaumont property came from a hunter who, lost in the swamps during a storm, approached the house seeking shelter. What he glimpsed through the windows was enough to send him straight to the sheriff's office upon his return to town. "I've never seen anything like it," stated George Landry, the hunter. Children were everywhere. Many of them didn't look right. It was like another world, a place where something had gone terribly wrong. When Agent Reynolds entered the property in July 1976, he began unraveling a cycle of horror that had endured for generations. But the real challenge would be dealing with the human consequences of this family tragedy. The authorities' intervention at the Beaumont property in July 1976 triggered an unprecedented social services operation in St. Landry Parish. The 15 children found in the home, 13 born of Jason and Sarah's relationship, plus Emma and a newborn of uncertain parentage, were immediately removed for medical evaluation. Dr. Thomas Williams, the pediatrician who coordinated initial care, described it as the most extreme case of medical neglect and genetic damage from consanguinity I have encountered in my 30-year career. Many children had never received any medical care. Beyond the obvious genetic issues, we found malnutrition, parasitic infestations, and signs of prolonged exposure to unhealthy conditions. The case's impact was so significant that an entire wing of Lafayette Regional Hospital was temporarily dedicated to the Beaumont children. Specialists from New Orleans and universities in other states were consulted for the most complex cases. Jason Beaumont was immediately arrested and charged with multiple crimes. Sarah was hospitalized for medical treatment and psychological evaluation. Her legal responsibility became a central debate in subsequent proceedings. Sarah Beaumont presented an extraordinarily complex legal and ethical case, explains attorney Charles Dupree, who assisted the district attorney. She was clearly a victim. Yet, in a technical sense, she was complicit in the neglect of the children. Psychological evaluations and the history of family endogamy strongly suggested a limited capacity for discernment and an inability to resist paternal authority. Jason Beaumont's trial, beginning in March 1977, became one of the most notorious in Louisiana history. The defense argued insanity based on family history and extreme isolation, but the jury rejected this. In May 1977, Jason was sentenced to multiple life terms without parole. During the trial, more disturbing details emerged. Jason had developed an elaborate belief system, documented in dozens of notebooks, in which he believed his family was chosen to maintain a pure lineage isolated from a contaminating world. Jason Beaumont's writings reveal a completely distorted worldview, analyzes forensic psychiatrist Dr. Paul Robichaud. He created a family mythology where isolation and endogamy were not just acceptable, but necessary for the lineage's spiritual survival. The fate of the Beaumont children became a primary concern. Due to their complex needs, most were placed in specialized institutions. Efforts to find adoptive families face challenges from the children's medical conditions and the case's associated stigma. Emma, Sarah's sister, was sent to an institution for the visually impaired in Baton Rouge. Years later, she would provide crucial insights into the family's distorted dynamics. "We were raised believing the outside world was dangerous," Emma recalled in a 1992 interview. "Our father said we could only trust family, that everyone else wanted to tear us apart and destroy our way of life. When you hear that every day in total isolation, you believe it." Sarah Beaumont spent 2 years in a psychiatric institution before being deemed competent to stand trial. Given her status as a victim and psychological assessments confirming her limited capacity to resist authority, she received a suspended sentence and entered a supervised rehabilitation program. In 1985, a team of geneticists from Tulane University published a detailed study on the Beaumont family's genetic patterns, which became a scientific reference on extreme consanguinity. The Beaumont case represents one of the most extreme examples of multi-generational endogamy documented in modern medical literature, wrote lead author Dr. James Monroe. The inbreeding coefficient of Jason and Sarah's children significantly exceeds any previously reported case, resulting in a near-catastrophic expression of deleterious recessive traits. The study identified over 30 distinct genetic conditions among the children, many extremely rare in the general population. The researchers estimated the statistical probability of so many conditions coexisting in a family without consanguinity was nearly zero. Nearly 50 years later, the shockwaves of this case continue to reverberate. Jason Beaumont died in prison in 1989 at age 57, showing no remorse. Sarah Beaumont, after years of rehabilitation, built a relatively stable life under a new identity in a small Texas city, where she lived until her death in 2011 at age 52. Of the 15 children found in 1976, only 9 survived to adulthood. Thomas, one of the youngest, who was 2 at the time of rescue, became an advocate for children's rights despite his own physical limitations. "What happened to my family wasn't just the act of a disturbed man," Thomas said in a rare 2018 interview. "It was the culmination of generations of isolation, lack of education, and cultural distortions that allowed destructive patterns to become normalized. The endogamy was just the most visible symptom of a much deeper problem." The Beaumont property, abandoned after the intervention, burned down in 1980. Some locals claim the fire was set deliberately to purge the site of its dark associations. Today, the area has been reclaimed by the swamp. The case's impact extended far beyond Louisiana. It inspired policy changes, including Louisiana's 1982 implementation of programs to monitor isolated communities. It remains a staple in medical ethics, genetics, and social work curricula, serving as a grim reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and the resilience of those who survive it. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying "watched" so I can know who truly appreciates these deep dives into the darker aspects of the human condition. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life cases that reveal shocking truths. Leave a like on this video and share it with someone who would find this account of social isolation's devastating consequences impactful. The Beaumont story serves as a dark reminder of the perils of extreme isolation and the distortions that can arise when communities sever ties with the broader social fabric. It is also a testament to human resilience, exemplified by the survivors who, against unimaginable odds, found meaning and purpose in their lives.